Hi everybody. This video is about biocentrism in environmental ethics. We'll be focusing on some assigned readings that we had from Paul Taylor and Jason Kawall. Before we start thinking about biocentrism, though, I think we might first want to start thinking about the most obvious alternative to biocentrism, something that's been a growing bogey in all of our sort of expanding moral community approaches to environmental ethics. And that idea is something that's known as anthropocentrism, from the Greek anthropos, meaning humans, and centrism, meaning what you might imagine centrism means. Anthropocentrism refers to any outlook in the context that we're encountering it. It's a moral outlook that's focused on human values and human interests. And we should start off by being clear that some sorts of anthropocentrism might very well be justifiable. For example, Jeff McMahon and Tom Reagan seem to adopt moral frameworks that unapologetically valued human lives over non-human animal lives, but they took great pains to point out that this isn't for arbitrary or self-serving reasons, but rather on the basis of objective characteristics that make for objective, non-sentimental differences in moral value represented by the lives of different sorts of creatures. Nonetheless, like racism and speciesism, the term anthropocentrism is usually used to indicate some sort of morally problematic, unjustified privileging of humans over non-humans, and it's easy to see how this can be, and frequently is, a very serious issue in environmental ethics. Much of our casual pretense that the needs and interests of non-humans must take a backseat to the needs and interests of humans is not really rooted in or justified by an honest attempt at objectively evaluating goods. Rather, it's usually motivated by the same sorts of moral selfishness and laziness that's found in egocentrism and ethical egoism, that dubious if depressingly popular theory that one need only pursue their own self-interest to do what's right. Judging humans by their actions, we've got a long way to go and some obvious problems to tackle before we would even begin to encounter serious and challenging puzzles about how to objectively weigh human and non-human moral interests. Most animal testing and animal agriculture isn't even close to being justified on non-anthropocentric terms. We've adopted horrifying practices that are driven by what's cheap and what's easy, and the interests of non-humans, and fairly often the interests of vulnerable humans who are caught up in these practices, are barely even recognized. We need to be sure that we keep a key distinction in mind when examining anthropocentrism, one that we were careful to point out when we were examining ethical egoism, the distinction between what is the case and what ought to be the case. It does seem to be a brute fact of human psychology that we tend to act in our own self-interest, but it's also a brute fact of human psychology that we're capable of rationally understanding the ways in which our own interests are mutually intertwined with the interests of others, and furthermore, we're capable of empathetically acting in the interests of others even at our own expense. The mere fact that many people are selfish doesn't tell us that this is how they ought to be. And what is the case, what ought to be the case, are two separate things. We've been here before. Similarly, most humans do seem to be anthropocentric. But ought they be? Certainly there are plenty of ways in which our naive, unreflective anthropocentrisms are unjustifiable. There may also be some seemingly good reasons for putting human interests ahead of non-human interests, but perhaps we should be wary of these reasons. After all, I'd say that we have good reason to suspect that we're more than a little bit biased when it comes to thinking about things from a perspective that privileges humans. We've all been raised in a human culture that takes human superiority over and the right to dominate non-humans as unquestioned givens. Perhaps we need to seriously consider whether even so-called objective appeals that value human lives over non-human lives aren't based on some anthropocentric assumptions. For example, it sure seems like a convenient coincidence that the most important kinds of mental capabilities that we've been looking at as a basis for the moral value of non-human animals are exactly the kinds of mental capabilities that we find important amongst humans: capacities for suffering, subjective psychological unity, rationality, etc. Perhaps we should notice that our moral community might be getting bigger as we continue in our inquiry here, but it sure seems like it's still centered on humans, literally an anthropocentric approach to ethics. So what would a more intentionally de-anthropocentric approach look like? Well, we get a decent depiction of what a biocentric egalitarianism might look like through Paul Taylor's 1981 essay, Biocentric Egalitarianism. In this account, Taylor offers what is clearly a deontic approach to biocentrism and also an individualist approach to biocentrism. In our discussions of Taylor's essay here, we'll get a clear sense of what those things mean. Taylor's out to show that respect for nature and a life-centered approach to environmental ethics are connected. More specifically, respect for nature has a central place in the foundation of a life-centered environmental ethics. And I'll make a note here that we're making a little bit of a shift here in talking about a respect for nature. But that's getting maybe a little bit ahead of things. We'll be turning our attention to nature more generally in some coming sessions. What we're focused on in this lesson is Taylor's focus on life as the significant criterion for moral value. And as I mentioned earlier, it's pretty clear right out of the gate that Taylor's working within a deontological framework, similar in structure to what we've already seen from folks like Kant and Reagan. Taylor holds that a set of moral norms governing human treatment of the natural world is rationally grounded if and only if 1. Commitment to these norms is a practical entailment of respect for nature as an ultimate moral attitude, and 2. Adopting this attitude on the part of all rational agents can be justified. That kind of nearly impenetrable and seemingly circular talk is certainly a hallmark of the deontic approach. Let's see if we can unpack this just a little bit. Without going very deep into the deontological weeds like we have in some other previous sessions, I'll try to skip right to the juicy bit here. It seems like Taylor is saying that the way in which respect for nature is functioning as foundational for life-centered ethics is that it rationally grounds such an ethics. And it does this by making the prescriptions that are generated by that ethical system nothing more than the performance of the respect for nature in some way that is universal for all rational agents. And the key to respecting nature, Taylor argues, is the recognition of the inherent value of non-humans. That is to say, not simply ascribing value to non-humans on the basis of what they can produce for humans, either in the sense of some kind of disinterested utilitarian benefit, or in the sense of moral attitudes led by sentiment or attachment. All things being equal, we ought to promote the good of a being for its own sake, not for the sake of some extrinsic end. And note here that by focusing on the inherent value of individuals, Taylor is arguing for a very specific kind of non-anthropocentrism. He's a bit non-committal as to whether or not his biocentrism is organicist, thus leaving open this possibility of including duties to artificial life. But an even more interesting prospect that he toys with somewhat ambivalently throughout the essay is a more holistic version of respect for nature that seeks a balance of natural ecological systems. Such an approach would value individual organisms, including humans, according to their contributions to the biotic community. We'll see this approach again soon when we talk about the land ethic, but for now we can be aware that Taylor is dismissing this option due to the fact that it appears to treat individuals as a mere means to an end, rather than an end in themselves. Here we see the way in which Taylor is not simply offering up any old attempt to ground a non-anthropocentric moral framework generally. He's offering up a very specific sort of grounding, one that's centered on respect for the inherent value of individual organisms. Maybe this isn't the only kind of alternative to anthropocentrism, but perhaps it might be the only well-grounded alternative. And Taylor takes an interesting route to the question of grounding, one that appears to be focused on what makes obligations or commitments to norms, rules, or duties intelligible to moral agents, that is to say, to rational agents. And this is interesting for a few reasons, perhaps the biggest of which is the fact that without the requisite concepts for making these duties intelligible, one can't actually have the sort of moral attitude that's required in order to have respect for nature. One might accidentally be committed to morally respectable actions in relation to nature, but they won't actually be acting from a sense of duty to nature. In other words, they won't be acting out of respect for nature. Motives matter, and this is standard fare for deontological moral reasoning. And the kinds of motives that deontologists are interested in are the kinds that come from rational understanding of our duty. This means that there are going to have to be some key concepts that make a practical commitment to respecting nature intelligible for the kinds of rational thinkers that are moral agents. And Taylor identifies two such concepts. These two requisite concepts that make respect for life intelligible, according to Taylor, are the good of a being and that being's inherent worth. He describes the good of a being as having interests, but does so in such a way that this doesn't require actually being interested. Think back to our discussion of Marion Dawkins's essay and her attempt to justify the moral considerability of animal suffering by making suffering scientifically intelligible. A big part of this involved a focus on behaviors that demonstrate a conscious preference. This is what Taylor means by being interested, a subjective awareness of preferences. But Taylor's looking for a more expansive notion of interest that includes cases where a living being is not necessarily aware of their interests in any meaningful way. Taylor's version of the good of a being, or having interests, or even the possibility of harm, ultimately is hung on the notion of an entelechy. That is to say, having a self-directed telos, or goal. Telos is the Greek word for goal, and entelechy refers to something having its goal already inside of itself. If we can distinguish between an organism that's doing well and one that's doing poorly, we've identified it as an entelechy, and thus as a being with a good of its own. Consider a tree, which as far as I can tell lacks the necessary neurological grounds for being interested in the sense of having an awareness of one's own interests. We can usually tell at a glance whether a tree is flourishing or foundering, and with a little bit of training in arboreal science, we could even get really good at it. And for the most part, the tree engages in behaviors of its own accord that facilitate its own flourishing. The tree's interests, the good of the tree, involve flourishing rather than foundering. Note here that we're not talking about my own self-interested valuing of the tree for my own enjoyment as something pretty to look at or hang a swing from or even cut down and make lumber out of, but the inherent value of the tree, which lies in its living the kind of life that is appropriate for the kind of thing that it is. Thus, the identification of a being with a good of its own dovetails neatly with the concept of inherent worth or inherent value. Since the good of a being is a good of its own, this good is not reducible to a mere means for some other being's good. It can't be an instrumental good for something else. It has to be an inherent good. And we can begin to see why it is that we should have a respect for nature that recognizes inherent value. And we can do this by way of an analogy to the kind of respect for persons that deontologists frequently like to go on about when they talk about human rights. The Kantian version of respect for persons is nothing more than recognizing persons as persons. To treat a human being as a mere means to an end is simply to ignore the fact that they are capable of making their own decisions and having a good of their own. To do otherwise is to treat a person as a mere object, as a non-person. Likewise, the question, why should we grant moral consideration to all living things, might be answered by simply noting that doing so is the practical consequence of regarding living beings as they are. This is a really interesting sort of justification for why we should have respect for all living things, one that has a distinctly deontological flavor. Taylor himself concedes that there is no real inductive or deductive proof involved in this justification. Instead, this justification has more of a coherentist spirit. That is to say, it's simply part of developing a coherent view of the world. By coherent, we mean here one that doesn't internally contradict itself. One might form such a coherent worldview that is fully anthropocentric, but to see non-human living things as having inherent value and a good of their own that is not reducible to human interests seems like it's a possible option as well. And it's worth noting that it's a richer option. It gives us a world with more significant beings. To the extent that Taylor is arguing for a biocentric rather than anthropocentric view, this argument is made in part as an appeal to a worldview that sees as much of the world as possible as it is. This coherent worldview is not simply reducible to a scientific descriptivist account, since we are somehow going to be generating moral imperatives from it, but neither is it divorceable from science. As Taylor notes, it's difficult to imagine a way to have a coherent moral framework that doesn't have respect for nature as its center, so long as we acknowledge the ecological fact of the interdependence of all living things. This brute ecological fact seemingly makes it impossible to coherently value our own personal good, or anthropocentric human good, without also recognizing the good of all living beings. Okay, so all of that preceding stuff is some groundwork for the account that Taylor is offering, and a lot of that also is some review of deontological moral reasoning in general. We're ready to take a closer look now at what Taylor thinks a biocentric outlook on nature entails, not just what grounds or justifies it. And Taylor offers this to us in 4 components of a biocentric outlook. Let's take a look at each of those 4 components individually. The first of those components concerns recognizing that humans are members of the Earth's community of life. Our being living things, interconnected and interdependent with all other living things, is a fundamental feature of our existence as humans. Being a living member of a biotic community is no less essential to what makes us human, in fact, as the capacity for rationality is. In fact, perhaps being alive is even more fundamental than rationality, as rationality depends upon being alive, and not the other way around. There's an echo here of something that we heard from Donaldson and Kimlicka, that we are citizens in a community, and that we might aptly think of our obligations in terms of being a member of that community. For those with deontological leanings, like Taylor, we can think of this as perhaps not being a freeloader, dependent on principles that others must abide by, but which we get to be convenient exceptions to. An anthropocentric worldview seems to try to pick and choose the ways in which we're members of the biotic community as it suits us. And few, if any, actually functioning communities work this way. Taylor notes the relatively recent arrival of our species in this biotic community. We are, in many ways, newcomers, perhaps with some of the trappings of being a guest more than a long-time resident. He quips about our tendency to regard the dinosaurs as some kind of evolutionary failure, noting that maybe we should hold off on such judgments until we've lasted even a tenth of the time that they did. Let's also keep in mind that the flourishing of other species is only rarely facilitated by humans. For the most part, we're a hindrance to other species, and our extinction would be a boon for most living things. And note that while this might raise questions about whether or not we're acting like the good, rational community members that we ought to be, this does not diminish our value as living things. Humans, too, have intrinsic worth by virtue of our possession of a good for ourselves, and that worth is not dependent on our contributions to our ecosystem. But we have to recognize that as rational creatures capable of doing ecological science, this good for humans can't be compatible with a disregard for the goods of the rest of the organisms that we live with. This has some significant thematic overlap with the second component of a biocentric outlook that Taylor discusses, and that component concerns the natural world as an organic system. Here again, Taylor is flirting with the notion of holistic ecosystems as potentially having some intrinsic good of their own. And while the door here is gapingly ajar for shifting completely to ecosystems as the primary object of moral consideration, Taylor still remains committed to an individualist approach. To put things in somewhat sharper relief here, Taylor is insisting that the holistic view that he's advocating for in this second component does not by itself constitute a moral norm. Instead, a respect for balance and equilibrium in natural ecological systems is merely a means to fulfilling the aim of realizing the goods for all who have a good for themselves. This balance is not an end that the goods of individual organisms can be casually sacrificed for. Being capable of taking this holistic view affords us knowledge through the descriptive science of ecology, and that knowledge enables us to be moral agents who can effectively respect life. Perhaps we might even be the only such moral agents. This brings us to the third component, and that concerns individual organisms as teleological centers of life. Any hesitation that we might have had as to whether or not Taylor is favoring an individualist or a full-blown holistic approach to biocentrism, such as the one that we'll encounter with the land ethic, can be conclusively put to bed in this section, where Taylor gives his account of individual organisms as teleological centers of life. He's clearly advocating for an individualist approach here. And as a reminder, what we mean here by a teleological center of life is that all living things are a unification of a whole collection of goal-oriented activities that seem to originate from the organism itself. And there's almost a phenomenological appeal here to the experience of coming to see an organism as an individual that seems to coincide with the experience of recognizing a being as a morally significant other. Consider how often you encounter humans as individuals, and compare that to how often you encounter animals or plants as individuals. Special animals, like my pets, might have names, but some other random dog? I'll probably just think of it as just a dog, not as some particular individual, but as a token of a type. How many insects do you recognize as individuals rather than as members of their species? How many plants? Of the plants that I do frequently regard as individuals, say for instance the gigantic tulip poplar in my backyard, doesn't the sort of relationship that enables me to see this as an individual seem to naturally come with a recognition of the tree's goal-oriented changes throughout time, a recognition that this tulip poplar is an entelechy? And Taylor points out that this isn't the same as anthropomorphizing non-human creatures. We need not see non-humans as if they were humans. We only need to see them as possessing a good for themselves, as living a life that is a unification of goal-oriented activities. This doesn't require that a tree have any conscious interestedness in its own interests, nor even that it's a subject of a life, just that it engages in self-directed activity that tends towards some end. What's required of us as moral agents is nothing more than the recognition of their individuality and inherent value. The fourth and final, and perhaps the most important aspect of Taylor's biocentric outlook is the denial of human superiority. It's not difficult to identify humans as differentiable from other species, but from whence comes any supposed superiority? There sure are some tempting answers, particularly within deontic lines of reasoning, that our superiority comes from not just having a good of our own, not just being a subject of a life, but being capable of reason and therefore being capable of moral agency. But again, on what basis would I call this a superiority rather than some kind of neutral difference? In many respects, we're actually inferior to most other animals who can generally run faster, jump higher, see, smell, and hear better, and take down prey more easily. We're begging the question when we automatically point to what makes us different as what makes us superior. Respecting humans isn't necessarily in tension with biocentrism, because treating humans as humans isn't quite the same as saying treat humans as inherently superior to all the other creatures. Another similar but distinct, though equally sticky, line of thought might note that as humans appear to be the only moral agents, all moral value is inherently anthropocentric. This, though, seems to be a little bit of sloppy reasoning. All moral value might be human moral value if humans are the only creatures that are capable of moral reasoning, but that doesn't mean that humans must only value what produces human benefit or human flourishing, what satisfies human interests. All moral values are perhaps anthropogenic, meaning that it comes from humans, but that's not the same as saying that human values are all anthropocentric, which is to say focused exclusively on humans and human interests. Maybe reason is essential to living a flourishing human life, but this isn't necessarily so for other forms of life. We ought no more think of non-humans as lesser by virtue of what they lack that humans have, than we ought to think of humans as lesser by virtue of what they lack that non-humans have. Taylor leaves a couple of issues hanging by the end of his analysis, including some ones that are, I think, fairly familiar to us at this point, if not still a little bit vexing. For the most part, this has to do with the problem of evaluating competing claims and weighing different kinds of value against one another in circumstances where we can't help but harm someone. We don't really get much guidance on this from Paul Taylor himself, in this essay at least, but we've seen a lot of approaches to this kind of problem already, and we're about to see some more, which gives us an excellent segue into Jason Kawall's virtue approach to biocentric individualism. If Paul Taylor is showing us a way to ground a biocentric respect for all life, not just the sentient or subjects of a life or those who are capable of rational agency, then Jason Kawall is more interested in how to put the sort of practical commitment that Taylor theoretically discusses into practice. By taking a virtue approach to the matter, he's chiefly concerned with the development of character traits in moral agents that facilitate human flourishing. While it might seem like relying on the character traits that facilitate human flourishing is a fairly anthropocentric lens, one might avoid such a charge by pointing out that it's probably part of virtuous character to not be too anthropocentric. This mirrors a similar critique with a similar response concerning whether or not virtue ethics is too egoistic, as it directs each individual to first and foremost be concerned with their own character and their own flourishing. The response from the virtue ethicist is that being too egoistic is not compatible with human flourishing. Key to finding a way through this apparent tension is the recognition that my own flourishing, or human flourishing generally, is a far more exotic sort of idea than my own benefit or human benefit. Human flourishing is being the best human that you can be, and this may demand that occasionally we forego benefit or even incur harm in order to be our best. Part of this lies in the way that virtue ethicists are always keen to point out that humans are naturally social creatures and thrive in healthy communities. No human can be at their best without exemplifying pro-social character. An unrestrained egoist is not a human at its best, as this is corrosive to the social fabric that we all require to be at our best. For that matter, a hermit who doesn't interact with other humans at all isn't living the best kind of human life. Frequently, virtue ethicists define virtues as means between two vicious extremes. This is what's known as the doctrine of the mean. And in the doctrine of the mean, every single virtue is going to be somewhere between two opposing vices, one of which is deficient with respect to this thing that the virtue is concerned with, and one of which is excessive with respect to that same thing. For example, the virtue of courage is opposed to two extreme vices. As courage concerns fear, both of these vices are also going to concern fear. The excessive vice, where we fear too much or fear too strongly such that we're incapable of acting in the ways that we need to, is what's known as cowardice. But there's another vice as well, a deficient vice in which we don't fear anything. What's recognized here in identifying courage as a virtuous mean is that it's important to fear actually dangerous stuff, and if we don't have enough fear, then we aren't courageous. We're some other vice that's opposed to cowardice. We are perhaps reckless. Courage, again, is that virtuous mean between the two extremes. It's the right amount of fear directed towards the right kinds of things and felt in the right kinds of ways. Similarly, we can apply this to selfishness as well, identifying selfishness as one excessive vice and some other kind of vicious deficiency of self-interest on the other side. Let's call this codependency. That seems to be a diagnosable psychological disorder in which I am too caught up in somebody else's needs and not recognizing my own. We might call the virtuous mean between these two things justice, a kind of appropriate evaluation of my own self-interested needs as well as the needs of others that I'm living with. The obvious analogy to anthropocentrism here draws us in. If human interests are as unavoidably tangled up with the interests of a larger biotic community as they are with the interests of other humans in our human communities, then humans can't be at their best while ignoring the needs of the biotic community of all living things. Virtuous human character can't be too anthropocentric. Too anthropocentric, as indicated by that word too, would be a vice, with some other kind of opposing vice that is not anthropocentric enough, that maybe doesn't appropriately evaluate, maybe like undersells human interests when we're thinking about our moral obligations. Let's call this misanthropy. It'd be a kind of a dislike or a disregard for humans and human interests. And a virtuous reverence for life is this virtuous mean between those two extremes. Kawall is quick to point out that he's aiming here to avoid a naive sort of anthropocentrism, not anthropocentrism altogether, and that while it might be incompatible with a lot of current human practices, the sort of virtuous reverence for life that he's talking about here, the kind that's a mean between two vicious extremes, isn't really all that contrary to common sense morality. This is a general hallmark of virtue approaches, as they always seem to be able to manage to harness the vagueness of that doctrine of the mean, to tune where the virtuous mean is to somewhere near our intuitions. And it's clear that there's some virtue concerning the valuing of any life whatsoever, and we can see this at work in a lot of our shared intuitions. For example, what seems like a shared intuition that it's right and good to make a very slight adjustment to one's gait to avoid crushing some insect while we're walking. Clearly there's such a thing as overzealously obsessing over each step to the point that you can only move very slowly. But if you see the insect, and it's no big deal to not crush it, it's fairly obvious that we should not carelessly end the bug's life. It doesn't matter if the bug is pretty or ugly, or any other sentimental or aesthetic attachment or revulsion to the bug that we might have. It doesn't even matter if the bug can feel pain, or engage in some other sort of higher level mental activity. All we need to know is that it's alive, that it has a good of its own, and that it's well within our ability to avoid killing it. We might equally test these intuitions with plants, or even other sorts of so-called lower organisms. If it would be only a very mild inconvenience to avoid killing a tree, it seems a pretty reasonable, if not widely shared intuition, that we ought to avoid killing the tree. And again, it doesn't much matter whether the tree is pretty or ugly, or if it's on private property or in the wild. I shouldn't just end its life without some good reason, and this is enough to tell us that some degree of shared reverence for life is plausible enough to commit to. But what about cases where we would have to endure significant inconvenience to spare a plant or an insect life? Kawall indicates that a virtue approach ought to spare us from an obligation to perform unreasonably heroic acts to save a bug or a plant, and he argues that such an approach really ought not be too demanding. But this might seem too weak to function as a moral theory. After all, we sometimes want to challenge our intuitions. But this might seem too weak to function as a moral theory. After all, we want sometimes to challenge our intuitions, particularly when they might be unreliable, and we want our moral prescriptions to be more demanding than whatever we feel like doing. We don't want a virtue approach to reverence for life to be unreasonably demanding, but we also don't want it to be too gentle. We don't want it to be empty or toothless. And Kawall is quick to point out that a virtue approach isn't empty, and it isn't toothless. Virtue is generally regarded as a sort of perfectionism tempered by pragmatism, with a keen awareness that we're always on the way to virtue and in need of corrections to habits and character that get us closer to this ideal. Virtue meets us where we are, but it also points us in the direction of where we want to go. Sure, there's such a thing as being too selfless, just like there's such a thing as being too selfish, and it isn't clear where the virtuous mean between these two is, but I definitely know which side of that mean I habitually err on. I'm generally too selfish, and I'm willing to bet that most humans are too. If I want to be better, I need to work on that by practicing selfless behavior. Similarly, while it's conceptually possible to be not anthropocentric enough, my sense is that most of us, at least most of the people who would bother to take an environmental ethics class, would concede that, for the most part, we tend to err on the side of being too anthropocentric. Often we can get of how to handle this through a virtue theory by thinking of heroic figures who exemplify the kind of character that's consistent with the best kind of human life as it concerns valuing all life. It's an instructive exercise to simply discuss these exemplary people, to get a sense of how our intuitions might differ from one another, but more importantly, where they might overlap. Wherever the virtuous mean of reverence for life is, I'm pretty sure that somebody like Albert Schweitzer or Jane Goodall is closer to it than I am, so I try to emulate them to get myself closer to my own potential for flourishing as it concerns respect for life. Now, some of these exemplary figures that we might pick to emulate might be a little bit controversial, or at least some of their habits might be a little bit controversial. But that controversy, I think, is interesting and provocative if we're genuinely in pursuit of virtue. Albert Schweitzer, for example, is quoted by Kawall as saying that if we're working by firelight, we should opt to close the window and deal with slightly stuffier air rather than watch insect after insect fly into the fire and die. This seems like a bold claim. What do you think? Is this right? Or would this count as too demanding, as Kawall puts it? On the other side of this question, Kawall makes frequent reference to what he takes to be an excessively demanding expectation that a human forego building a patio in order to spare all of the plant, insect, and other lives that would be lost in the process. And I think it's right to ask ourselves, is this really too demanding? Or is Kawall's intuition letting us off too easy here? After all, how hard is it to simply not build the patio, to, for example, sit in the grass with all of the other creatures rather than killing those creatures and sitting on bricks or concrete? Don't we have a moral obligation to at least seriously consider that our backyard space should have as little impact on the biotic community as possible, and that we should take that into consideration when making decisions about how to design that space? Kawall, like many of the others that we've seen in past sessions, holds that an appropriate valuing of all life doesn't demand that we treat all living things the same, but that we treat each living thing appropriately. But there again, our real puzzle seems to lie in figuring out what is appropriate in instances where we have to weigh the value of certain lives against others. For example, we've got to eat, and this means unavoidably killing something, at least given our current technological capabilities. In addition to being allowed to eat, we should seemingly be allowed to protect ourselves from other living organisms like, wild animals that might attack us or bacterial infections, even if this means killing those animals, even if it means eradicating a whole colony of streptococcus on my throat. I should be able to build shelter or maybe even plant a garden, but I can't build a house or plant a garden without killing a fair number of insects and plants and other living things. How far should reverence for life push me here? Should it prevent me from building a house or planting a garden? Does it mean that I should disregard what seems like a pretty strong intuition that I should attend to the needs of starving humans before attending to the needs of a struggling bee colony? Kawall entertains the possibility of addressing this pesky problem with an appeal to the supererogatory. In all of those cases where sacrificing comfort out of concern for living things seems too demanding, we might say that making such a sacrifice is good, but not obligatory. But this doesn't really solve the problem of where we draw the line between obligation and whatever is beyond obligation, whatever is too demanding. It only draws another line, leaving us wondering where that line ought to be drawn. Furthermore, drawing on some deontic puzzles concerning distinctions between perfect and imperfect duties, Kawall points out that when we identify something as supererogatory, what we're implicitly agreeing to is the notion that somebody could be a good person without ever doing that supererogatory act. For example, if each individual instance of helping a homeless person is supererogatory, then that means that a person can go their entire life without ever helping a homeless person and still be counted as a good person, still be counted as having good character. And there's something that seems awfully wrong about that. Sure, we can't expect that anybody helps every single homeless person that they see, but shouldn't you help the homeless sometimes? Kawall also gives us this example of refraining from killing an annoying insect that's buzzing around your head. If we call that supererogatory, then that means that somebody could go their entire life never refraining from killing those insects and still count themselves as a good person. And Kawall asks, shouldn't the fly win sometimes here? Doesn't being a good person mean that we sometimes do these things that are getting called supererogatory? So there are some seriously unresolved issues in play here, mostly surrounding this persistent and pesky question concerning priority principles for dealing with circumstances where we have to pick between competing values. Kawall gestures towards several approaches to this. The first of these such priority principles is offered up by our old friend Paul Taylor. Namely, this is a self-defense principle. This helps me deal with questions like, should I be allowed to defend myself against bacterial infection? Or maybe even, can I kill in order to avoid starvation? If I have a right to self-defense, then I have a right to preserve my own life, even if that means at the expense of some other creature, particularly one that's trying to harm me. But as Kawall points out, a self-defense principle like this doesn't really help us out with cases where we might need to intervene in order to help a third party not starve or get sick. Intuitively, it doesn't seem wrong to act to eradicate a disease to save not only ourselves, but to save other humans. In fact, it seems like we might have an obligation to intervene in this way, even if it means wiping out an entire species of organisms out. Taylor's approach seems to grant me the right to privilege my own safety, but not the safety of other humans when they're threatened by hostile organisms. And that seems to maybe miss the mark a little bit. Kawall draws on James Sturba, who offers some tweaks to Taylor's self-defense principle, by opening it up to the defense of any individual organism against any aggression that frustrates the basic or even the non-basic needs for some other organism. However, Sturba seems to limit our permission to defend against aggression with in-kind aggression, by also including a sort of a quasi-contractual mutual non-aggression principle. According to Sturba, we may not invoke this broad principle of defense against those from whom we can reasonably expect a comparable degree of altruistic forbearance. This might seemingly, Kawall argues, allow us to defend another human from attack by bacteria, even if that bacteria isn't threatening the human's life, and would even explain why it would be wrong to try to defend the bacteria from the human who's attacking the bacteria with antibiotics, as we can expect altruistic forbearance from the human, but not the bacteria. We have a kind of a mutual non-aggression principle that we can share with other humans, but we can't really share that with the bacteria. However, as Kawall points out, this wouldn't allow us to do some other intuitively morally obligatory things, like, say, defend a pet cat from the same sorts of bacterial infections that we're thinking about defending humans from. This is because the cat doesn't appear to be capable of the sort of altruistic forbearance that abiding by a mutual non-aggression principle seems to require. Defending the bacteria from the cat, or the cat from the bacteria, seems at best equally justifiable. At worst, both are equally impermissible. So even if we have some sort of tool for justifying a privileging of human interests over non-human interests in the most demanding sort of circumstances, as Kawall puts it, at this point it seems like we have this lingering, more abstract problem concerning how to prioritize interests of competing non-human organisms. Kawall turns last to an attempt by Gary Varner to address these issues, who, unlike Taylor and Sturba, takes a sophisticated consequentialist rather than a deontic approach to biocentric individualism, one where the comparative value of interests is a function of a hierarchy of mental capacities. We've seen this sort of thing before. The death of an entity that has desires is more morally weighted than the death of an entity that does not have desires. The death of an entity that is a subject of a life carries more weight than the death of an entity that's not a subject of a life. The death of an entity that's capable of moral agency is more morally weighty than the death of an entity that does not have moral agency, etc., etc. Varner is, as Kawall notes, careful to qualify these priority principles as holding only generally, which seems pretty par for the course for any consequentialist. After all, any particular weighing of competing values is going to be subject to the idiosyncrasies of the aggregate benefits and harms at stake in some particular decision. Still, and I suspect many of you will share Kawall's intuition here, this seems to be way too permissive and too anthropocentric. The door is wide open to allowing humans to disregard the interests of lower animals altogether for the sake of higher pleasures, so-called higher pleasures only available to humans. For example, as we see here in these images, it seems like on Varner's approach, the human interest in being able to appreciate art outweighs the interest of, a turtle to avoid getting caught up in plastic six-pack rings. But those don't actually seem equally weighty. If I had a choice between, like, I would get to go see some paintings or I could save a turtle from the plastic six-pack rings, it seems like the right thing to do there is to tend to the turtle rather than to turn to something as frivolous as enjoying art. And I say that as somebody who enjoys art a lot. If this is an accurate depiction of Varner's approach, then this reeks of the very sort of anthropocentric human superiority that we just saw Taylor criticizing, where the most important goods just so happen to be all the goods that are enjoyed by humans exclusively. In all these proposals from Taylor, Sturba, and Varner, a running theme in Kawall's criticisms seems to be that we can't seem to devise rules that fit all and only the sorts of circumstances that we want. When we're trying to figure out these priority principles, none of them really seems to work in all cases. This is another hallmark of a virtue approach, and it's related to one that was mentioned previously. Virtue ethicists tend to be wary of hyper-specific, inflexible rules, recognizing that we seem to always find exceptions to even our best rules, and that we can't anticipate every possible idiosyncratic circumstance that we might find ourselves in. Deontic rules always seem to be plagued by these exceptional cases, but we really don't do much better by turning to some form of consequentialism like utilitarianism, as no human agent can really be expected to perform the endless moral calculations that are required by consequentialist approach to ethics. Virtuous moral agents have a sensitivity to the exceptions to what might otherwise be generally good rules, just like a virtuosic musician knows when to break the guidelines of music theory. To develop a virtuous character is not to be a robotic rule follower or calculator, but to have virtuous behavior flow naturally from one's character without constant recourse to abstract principles. To develop the virtue of reverence for life, we need to cultivate the right kinds of sensitivities to the value of living things. And as we do this, we'll find that we'll have more insight into ways that we can further develop and hone those sensibilities. So I think we've got plenty to think about and discuss here. Culled, as usual, from the most excellent focus question discussion, here are some distilled discussion questions for us to mull over online. The first of these concerns this question of identifying exemplars, or heroes, or role models, people who exemplify this virtue of reverence for life that Kawall is talking about. Who are some of the people that we should be emulating here? Who are the virtuous folks when it comes to reverence for life? Number two concerns, I think, perhaps an overlooked question in talking about reverence for life or respect for life, and that is, what counts as alive? Viruses, do they count? Are they covered in respect for life? What about artificial life, whether that's the kind of thing that's cobbled together out of organic materials in a laboratory or the kind of thing that is a computer that's become so sophisticated that we would say that it's alive now? What about the sorts of things, these kind of aggregates of organisms that all seem to function together, sometimes referred to as holobionts or ecosystems? Do these things count as alive? Do these things have a good of their own? Question number 3 deals with a series of concrete circumstances and asks us about what our biocentric obligations in those circumstances ought to be. The first has to do with this example that Kawall seemed to think was very intuitive, but at least one person on the discussion board thought maybe wasn't as intuitive as Kawall thought. And it's this question about whether or not I have an obligation to try to avoid stepping on a bug, so long as it only really is a very mild inconvenience for me to change where I'm stepping. The second example is, I think, a much more difficult sort of a case. It's the one that Schweitzer is talking about with respect to like working by lamplight. If I'm working by lamplight with a fire, and I see that insects are continuously flying into the fire and dying, do I have a moral obligation to close my window, even if that means that I have to work in a somewhat stuffy room now? And the third example there is one that Kawall seems to think is way too demanding to say that like we shouldn't build a patio in order to save the lives of all of the creatures that would die in the building of the patio. He says that like of course you should be able to build your patio, but that's, I don't know, that strikes me as like maybe too soft of a version of obligations that come from a reverence for life. So what do we think about that? Is it wrong to build a patio rather than finding some other kind of gentler way of enjoying my backyard? Number 4 looks simple, but it's actually a little bit complicated. It comes from a question that somebody posted that was asking about Jason Kawall's discussion of disrespecting nature. And I pointed out in response to them that we shouldn't take Kawall as saying that there's some kind of universal moral law that tells us that we must respect nature, because that seems to be inconsistent with his virtue approach. So what then is wrong with disrespecting nature, according to Kawall, if it's not some kind of universal moral law that we'd be breaking by disrespecting nature? In what way would we say that disrespecting nature is wrong? And last but not least, and this is a question that I think we've seen before, but it's worth bringing up again now, I think, at this point. And I don't think that we necessarily made satisfactory progress on it in previous iterations, but how do humans determine the good of its own for some non-human organism? I talked casually about, a tree having a good of its own, but when you stop and think about it, that's a little bit mysterious. It's not clear exactly what the good of a tree is, if I'm not reducing it to like good for my needs. What is the good of a tree? What is the good of a horse? What is the good of a rabbit or a bumblebee or an ant? In some way that doesn't reduce that good to like good for the sake of something else. What is it? What are we talking about when we talk about the good of its own for some non-human organism? And how do we figure out what that good is? I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to think about this stuff, and I hope everybody's doing well.